A woman defies all warnings to reunite with the bear she raised, risking everything to see if their bond has withstood the call of the wild. What unfolds next will leave you breathless. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Emma never expected her life to change that day on the rugged mountain trail. She was simply going about her routine, collecting firewood and checking traps in the early morning light when a faint whimpering sound broke the stillness of the forest. She paused, heart quickening as she followed the tiny cries that echoed off the towering pine trees. The sound grew louder as she moved further into the shadows, pushing aside branches until she finally spotted the source, a tiny bear cub, no more than a few weeks old, lying helpless and alone. He was malnourished, with ribs visible beneath his dull, matted fur, his large brown eyes fixed on her with a look that conveyed both terror and need. In that moment, Emma's heart ached with a sympathy she hadn't felt in years. Her cabin was small, her resources limited, but something inside her couldn't bear to leave him there to perish. Gently, she picked him up, wrapping him in her worn jacket, and carried him back to her home nestled on the edge of the forest. She named him Oso, a nod to his wild heritage and the spirit he would soon reclaim. In the beginning, it was a trial of survival. Emma scoured books and talked to anyone who knew anything about wildlife care. She fed him carefully, learning which foods were safe and what to avoid, spending countless nights awake to monitor his breathing and comfort him as he whined in the dark. She'd raise him, she decided, at least until he was strong enough to survive on his own. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Emma and Oso deepened with every sunrise. Her life became a rhythm built around his needs, feeding, nurturing, and keeping him warm through the cold mountain nights. The more he grew, the more his playful personality emerged, filling the quiet solitude of her days. Oso had a habit of clumsily knocking things over in the cabin, much to Emma's amusement and occasional frustration. She'd laugh as he batted at her old slippers, flipping them across the room or clawing curiously at the blankets on her bed. In those moments, Emma forgot he was a wild creature destined to leave her. He was simply her friend, her companion in an otherwise lonely world. Oso grew quickly, his soft cub fur thickening and darkening as he transformed from a helpless little ball of fluff into a powerful adolescent bear. But along with his size came whispers of concern from the nearby village. Emma would occasionally head into town for supplies, and when word got out that she was raising a bear, people started warning her. Friends, even strangers, cautioned her that this bond couldn't last. "He's a wild animal, Emma," they'd say, their voices laced with worry. "No matter how close you two get, he'll eventually turn on you. It's just nature." Emma would nod, giving them the answer they wanted, but deep down, she dismissed their fears. She knew Oso, and he knew her. They shared a bond stronger than mere instinct, she was sure of it. As Oso continued to grow, the village whispers turned to concerned pleas. She could see it in their eyes, the judgment that seemed to say she was reckless, perhaps even foolish, for believing a human could forge a lasting friendship with a wild bear. Still, Emma couldn't let go of him. Oso was her family, the only soul who filled the empty spaces of her life. She tried to tell herself that when the time came, she'd find the strength to let him go. But as each day slipped by, the thought of saying goodbye grew more unbearable. Instead, she focused on the present, on every moment they spent together, from the sun-dappled mornings when he'd follow her into the forest, sniffing curiously at flowers and scratching his back against the trees, to the peaceful evenings they spent on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and purple over the distant mountains. However, one chilly autumn morning, Emma awoke with a sinking feeling. She found Oso pacing by the door, his restlessness unmistakable. His wild instincts were calling, a pull he could no longer resist. Emma knew that she couldn't keep him forever, that he deserved to experience the world beyond the walls of her cabin. Fighting back tears, she led him deep into the forest, her hands shaking as she told him it was time to be free. She whispered a tearful goodbye, telling him to live his life in the wild, to be the bear he was meant to be. With a heavy heart, she watched him vanish into the trees, his familiar figure soon swallowed by the dense forest. Returning to an empty cabin felt like a punch to her chest. The silence was suffocating, an unwelcome reminder that Oso was gone. Days passed, and Emma tried to adapt to her solitary life, but every time she saw his empty bed in the corner or the claw marks on her porch railing, she felt the sharp pang of loss all over again. Oso's absence was a weight she carried everywhere, a constant ache that no amount of time or distraction could ease. She often found herself wandering near the forest's edge, hoping against hope to catch a glimpse of him, even if only from afar. One stormy night, as thunder echoed across the mountains and lightning lit up the sky, Emma heard news that stirred a blend of fear and hope within her. A bear had been sighted close to the village, roaming near the edge of the forest. Her heart raced as she wondered if it could be Oso. Ignoring the villagers' pleas to stay away, Emma set out into the storm, her only thought to see him again, to know if he remembered her. She moved quickly through the rain-soaked forest, her steps guided by a mix of instinct and longing. She was drenched and trembling, but her determination never wavered. Finally, she saw him, a massive, shadowy figure in a clearing, illuminated by flashes of lightning. For a moment, Emma was paralyzed by both fear and awe. Oso had grown even larger, his muscles rippling beneath his thick fur as he moved with the power of a true wild bear. He looked different now, every inch a creature of the wilderness. But then he stopped, lifting his head as if sensing her presence. His dark eyes met hers, and in that instant, she knew he recognized her. Emma took a hesitant step forward, and Oso responded, slowly moving toward her. Her heart swelled as she felt the bond they shared, undiminished by time or distance. The scene was one of raw emotion, their reunion powerful and unspoken. Emma extended her hand, her fingers trembling as she reached for him. Gently, Oso pressed his snout into her palm, his touch familiar yet different, a reminder of the cub he had once been and the powerful bear he had become. The two stood in silence, connected by a friendship that defied logic and nature. But just as she felt their bond reignite, voices and footsteps broke the stillness. The villagers had followed, carrying rifles and shouting warnings as they saw her standing so close to the massive bear. In that tense moment, Oso sensed the danger and stepped between Emma and the approaching men, a fierce protectiveness in his stance. Emma's heart pounded as she realized the depth of his loyalty. She begged the villagers to lower their weapons, to understand that Oso wasn't a threat. Her pleas hung in the air, and one by one, they relented, moved by the trust and loyalty displayed before them. As Oso slowly retreated into the darkness, Emma felt a bittersweet mix of relief and sadness, knowing he was returning to the wild where he truly belonged. She watched him disappear into the trees once more, their bond unbroken but destined to live only in memory. Emma returned to her cabin, her heart both heavy and full, carrying with her the memory of the bear she loved and let go, the friend who had come back to her when she needed him most. As Oso continued to grow, so did the whispers of concern and judgment from those around Emma. The mountain village was small, and word traveled fast. Every villager knew about the bear cub she had taken in. What began as curious gossip soon became worry, especially as Oso transitioned from a harmless cub to a towering young bear. Emma had been visited by almost everyone in the village at some point, from the local shopkeepers to the elders, all carrying the same message: it's not safe to keep him with you. Her friends, even those who understood her gentle nature, started to voice their concerns with a sternness Emma hadn't seen before. The forest ranger, Tom, was perhaps the most vocal of them all. A rugged man with decades of experience in wildlife preservation, Tom understood bears better than most. He'd sat down with Emma in her cabin, his eyes serious as he tried to make her understand. "Emma, I know what Oso means to you," he began, choosing his words carefully, "but bears aren't pets. No matter how much you love him, his instincts are going to kick in sooner or later." Emma felt her stomach twist at his words. She knew Oso had instincts. She'd seen glimpses of them when he would swipe playfully, his claws unknowingly leaving scratches on her wooden furniture, or when he'd sniff the air and growl softly at noises in the distance. But to Emma, Oso was still the cub she had found trembling in the rain, the one who nuzzled into her neck for warmth and safety. The idea of him turning on her felt impossible, even absurd. Yet Tom didn't relent. Bears, especially males, have a strong sense of territory. When he gets older, he might not see you as his mother anymore, but as a stranger, or worse, a threat. He paused, leaning forward. And Emma, I'd hate to see anything happen to you. You know what the villagers are saying. If he ever lashes out, even by accident, people won't hesitate to put him down. They're afraid of him. The words sank in, piercing through her resistance. The thought of Oso being hurt, or worse, killed, was unbearable. She had saved him, raised him, and loved him. He was a part of her life in a way few people could understand. Yet, the idea of him being a threat, even unintentionally, was a possibility she couldn't entirely dismiss. As the weeks passed, Emma found herself watching Oso with new eyes, noticing the subtle changes in him. He was bigger now, towering over her when he stood on his hind legs, his muscles rippling under his thickening fur. He'd begun venturing deeper into the woods during the day, exploring his surroundings and occasionally bringing back small animals he'd hunted. Emma's heart broke every time she saw him dragging his prize back to her, proudly showing off his growing skills as if to please her. It was a reminder of the wild instincts that were surfacing, instincts that, as much as she wanted to, she couldn't control or tame. One evening, as she sat by the fire with Oso resting beside her, Emma noticed something that struck her with a pang of sadness. His gaze wasn't on her, but on the door, his eyes alert and ears twitching at every sound outside. He seemed distracted, almost restless, as though a part of him was yearning for something beyond the safety of their cabin. She reached out to scratch behind his ear, something he had always loved, but this time, he pulled away slightly, his head turning toward the window. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. A wave of sorrow washed over her. The connection they shared was still there, but it was changing, becoming more distant as he grew into his instincts and natural behaviors. The following day, she visited the local animal sanctuary to seek advice. The staff there, familiar with Emma's story, were sympathetic but firm. They echoed what Tom had said, he's still young now, but that's going to change. Bears have strong predatory instincts, especially males. They're wild animals, Emma. No amount of love can make him into something he's not. They offered to help transition Oso to a sanctuary environment, somewhere he could live freely without posing a risk to anyone. Emma listened politely, but the thought of handing him over to strangers, of abandoning him to an unfamiliar place, filled her with dread. On her way home, she stopped by the local grocery store, only to overhear a couple of villagers talking about her. "She's being reckless, keeping a bear like that," one of them muttered, shaking his head. "It's only a matter of time before something goes wrong. People need to be safe around here." The word stung, but she understood their fear. They didn't see Oso as she did. To them, he was just a wild animal, a potential danger lurking on the edge of their community. As Emma walked back to her cabin, she felt a growing weight on her heart. She'd always believed in the bond she shared with Oso, that somehow their love would be enough to keep him close and gentle. But now, doubt was creeping in, eroding the confidence she had once felt. Was she being selfish, clinging to him despite knowing the risks? Could she bear the responsibility if he ever hurt someone, even accidentally? That night, Emma lay awake, listening to the sounds of Oso moving around the cabin. Every time he stretched, his claws made soft scraping sounds on the wooden floor, a reminder of the powerful creature he had become. She closed her eyes, memories flooding back, Oso as a tiny cub, curled up in her lap, his fur soft and warm, his eyes wide with trust and innocence. She wanted so desperately to believe that he would never harm her, that their bond would withstand anything. But the warnings echoed in her mind, voices of people who cared for her, who were only trying to protect her from a danger she couldn't fully see. Over the following days, Emma began testing small boundaries with Oso, hoping to gauge his reactions. She'd keep a little more distance, observing him from afar as he played or ate. Once, she left the cabin for several hours, just to see if he would notice her absence, if he'd miss her. When she returned, Oso was waiting outside, his large form casting a shadow across the porch. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite define, a mixture of relief and mild annoyance, as if to say, "Where were you?" Her heart lifted at his recognition, at the proof that he still saw her as his family, but she couldn't shake the fear that lingered beneath. One afternoon, Tom returned, this time with a letter from a wildlife reserve that had heard about Emma and Oso. They were offering to take him, to provide a safe environment where he could thrive among his own kind. Think about it, Emma, Tom said gently. He'd be with other bears, in a place designed for animals like him. It's a chance for him to live freely, without the risk of hurting anyone. And it's a way to keep him safe from people who don't understand. Emma took the letter, her hands trembling. She knew he was right, this was a chance to give Oso the life he was meant for. But the thought of losing him, of not being there to watch him grow, to feel his comforting presence by her side, was a loss she didn't know if she could endure. Still, as she looked at the letter, she understood that love sometimes meant letting go, that maybe the greatest act of love was to set him free. The days passed in a blur as Emma wrestled with her decision. She could feel the clock ticking, each day bringing Oso closer to adulthood, to a point where he might become unpredictable. The warnings had become a steady drumbeat in her mind, impossible to ignore. She knew that keeping him with her was no longer just about their bond, it was a decision that impacted everyone around her. With a heavy heart, she began to accept that the time was coming for her to let him go. But in the quiet moments, when Oso would sit beside her, leaning his massive head against her shoulder, Emma allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe their love could transcend nature's boundaries. Maybe, despite all the warnings, he would remember her as the one who saved him, who loved him, who gave him a home. And in those fleeting moments, she held on to the hope that somehow, they could defy the odds. The dawn arrived quietly, a soft, gray light stretching over the treetops as if the mountains themselves were reluctant to wake. Emma, bundled in her thick coat against the chill, prepared herself for the journey she had dreaded for weeks. Today, she would take Oso deep into the forest, the place she had carefully selected in her mind countless times. It had taken her days of wandering through the woods to find the right spot, a clearing near a river with abundant food and shelter, far enough from the village to keep him safe and far enough that she would never be tempted to seek him out. This was her final gift to him. Oso, sensing something unusual, followed her closely, his dark eyes watchful as he lumbered alongside her. He was enormous now, towering over her with thick fur that gleamed in the soft morning light, a far cry from the tiny, frightened cub she'd found by her cabin door 2 years ago. The memory of that day played in her mind like a haunting song, the sight of his tiny body trembling in the snow, his soft whimpers reaching her as if he knew she was the only one who could save him. She had scooped him up, cradling him to her chest as he snuggled into her warmth. From that moment on, they had been inseparable. Each step deeper into the forest was a quiet ache in her heart. She had spent countless hours with him, watching him grow, teaching him, and learning from him in return. She remembered the way he would nuzzle her hand when he wanted attention, the low rumble he'd make when she sang to him by the fire, and the playful way he'd swat at her braid, thinking it was some kind of forest creature. They had become each other's family, bound by a love that defied logic and nature. Yet, as he grew, so did the warnings, the cautious words from those who cared about her, who feared the unpredictable strength of a wild animal. And she had seen it too, the brief flashes in his eyes, the instincts lurking beneath his calm demeanor. She knew that letting him go was the right choice, the only choice. The clearing was just up ahead now, and Emma's legs felt like lead as she approached it. The ground here was soft with fallen leaves, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. She stopped, letting Oso explore, watching as he sniffed at the ground, his nose twitching with curiosity. He wandered a few feet away, his massive body moving with a grace that still amazed her. He belonged here, she thought, in the vastness of the wild, where he could be free and live without the confines of human expectations or fear. She took a shaky breath, steeling herself for what she had to do. Oso, she called softly, her voice breaking. He lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes gentle and trusting. How could she explain to him what was happening? How could he understand that she wasn't abandoning him out of cruelty but out of love? She knelt down, beckoning him to her, and he came, plodding forward with a quiet huff. She reached out, placing her hands on either side of his face, feeling the warmth beneath his thick fur, the steady rise and fall of his breath. "You need to stay here now," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "You need to live free. This is where you belong, Oso." Her words were barely audible, swallowed by the silence of the forest, but she needed to say them, if only for herself. Oso watched her, his gaze unwavering, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of understanding. He nudged her hand with his nose, as if sensing her sadness, his large, dark eyes filled with something she could only describe as sadness. She pressed her forehead to his, her heart breaking with the knowledge that this was their final moment together. Every memory, every shared look, every laugh, they all rushed through her, like a river bursting its banks. She wanted to stay in this moment forever, to ignore reason and take him back to her cabin, to pretend that they could continue on as they had before. But she knew it was impossible. He was no longer the cub she could cradle in her arms, he was a powerful creature with instincts she couldn't contain. Finally, she pulled away, her hands trembling as she stood up. She stepped back, her body rigid as she fought against the urge to call him back, to reach for him one last time. Oso watched her, his ears perked, his body poised as if waiting for a signal. But Emma forced herself to turn, to walk away without looking back. Each step felt like a betrayal, a tearing away of a part of her soul. She wanted to look over her shoulder, to see him one last time, but she knew if she did, she would crumble, and she couldn't allow herself that weakness. As she walked, the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees towering overhead like silent witnesses to her pain. She felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, a grief so deep that it left her breathless. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, that she had steeled herself for the inevitable, but nothing could have prepared her for the emptiness that settled within her. She could no longer hear Oso's footsteps behind her, and the silence was unbearable. When she finally reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped, unable to move any further. She took a deep, shuddering breath and whispered into the cold air, hoping somehow the words would reach him. "Be safe, Oso. Be happy." Her voice broke, and she clamped a hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to spill over. She stayed there for a long moment, feeling the ache in her chest, the hollowness that he had left behind. Then, as if summoned by her unspoken wish, she heard a soft rustling behind her. She turned, and there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her with those soulful eyes. He didn't move toward her, didn't make a sound, but she knew he was saying goodbye in his own way, letting her know that he understood, that he was ready to face the wild. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their bond filling the space between them. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant turn, he walked away, disappearing into the forest as silently as he had come into her life. Emma stayed there, rooted to the spot, long after he was gone. She felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, a quiet sense of peace mingled with a deep, aching loss. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But the knowledge didn't ease the pain, didn't fill the emptiness he had left behind. She turned and walked back to her cabin, each step heavier than the last, the silence of the forest pressing in on her like a physical weight. Back at her cabin, she sat by the fire, staring into the flames as memories of Oso filled her mind. She thought of his playful antics, the way he'd paw at her boots when he wanted to play, the soft sounds he'd make when he was content. She would never hear those sounds again, never feel the warmth of his presence beside her. He was gone, and though her heart would always carry his memory, the reality of his absence was a wound that would never fully heal. In the days that followed, Emma found herself walking to the edge of the forest each morning, scanning the trees, hoping for a glimpse of him, even though she knew he wouldn't return. She told herself it was just habit, that she was simply adjusting to life without him. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She missed him with an intensity that surprised her, an ache that seemed to grow rather than fade with each passing day. As the seasons changed, she gradually accepted his absence, finding solace in the thought that he was living as he was meant to, free, wild, and unbound. She held on to the memory of their last moment together, the quiet understanding in his eyes, the silent goodbye they had shared. It was a moment she would carry with her always, a memory that would remain etched in her heart, a testament to a love that transcended words and defied the boundaries between species. In the end, she knew she had given him the greatest gift she could, the freedom to be himself. And though it broke her heart to let him go, she found comfort in knowing that somewhere out there, Oso was living his life as he was meant to, in the vast wilderness that had always called to him. And perhaps, in some way, he missed her too. The weeks following the goodbye felt like a slow, endless march of time. The mornings were quiet, too quiet. Emma would wake early, instinctively reaching for Oso, only to remember he was no longer there. Her cabin, once filled with the sounds of heavy footsteps and the occasional playful growl, had grown eerily still. The warmth she had felt in his presence, the comfort of knowing he was there, was gone, leaving a void in its place that seemed impossible to fill. She spent her days walking through the forest, seeking solace in the familiarity of the trees, the rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of birds. These had been the sounds that once accompanied her and Oso on their countless adventures, exploring hidden groves, playing near streams, and simply sharing each other's company. But now, each step she took seemed empty, as though the forest had become a shadow of what it once was. Without Oso, every inch of the landscape felt like it was missing a piece, as if the very air had lost its vibrancy. The nights were the hardest. When the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Emma found herself lying awake, staring out the window at the dark expanse. The gentle night breeze that had once carried the comforting scent of Oso's fur now seemed hollow, devoid of the presence she had come to rely on. The stillness of the night amplified the loneliness she had never fully understood until now. Her thoughts would drift back to the moment she had said goodbye, her heart breaking once more with each recollection. She had tried to be strong, to tell herself that it was the right thing to do, that Oso deserved to live freely. But no matter how many times she repeated those words, they did little to soothe the ache deep within her chest. Her friends in the village tried to comfort her, offering kind words and distractions, but none of them could understand the depth of her loss. They had never seen the bond she shared with Oso, nor could they appreciate the complexity of the emotions tied to raising such a wild creature. They didn't know what it felt like to see that bear, once so small and fragile, grow into the powerful and majestic animal that now roamed the forests. They didn't know the hours spent together, training him, laughing with him, and being amazed by his intelligence and compassion. It was a bond that transcended the typical relationship between humans and animals. Oso wasn't just a bear, he had been her companion, her confidant, and in many ways, he had been the closest thing to family she had ever known. In the absence of Oso, Emma's thoughts began to drift to darker places. Was it possible that he had forgotten her already? Had she made the right decision by sending him away? The self-doubt crept in like a shadow, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had abandoned him, that she had taken away his chance to live a life with her, one filled with the love and protection she had given him since the day she found him as a tiny cub. One evening, as the first frost of winter began to settle over the forest, Emma found herself standing at the edge of the woods, gazing into the distance. The trees, now bare and silhouetted against the cold sky, seemed to stretch endlessly, as if reaching toward something unknown. The mountains beyond looked forbidding, covered in a blanket of snow that glistened under the dimming sun. She felt a deep ache in her chest as she stared at the forest, wondering where Oso was now, what he was doing, whether he had found a new place to call home. It was during these moments, standing at the threshold of the forest, that Emma would allow herself to imagine what Oso's life might be like out there. She imagined him roaming the wild, free to hunt, to climb, to explore without the restrictions of human presence. She imagined him standing tall on his hind legs, looking out over the vast expanse of the land, a creature of strength and grace. And though she would tell herself that it was for the best, that this was the life he was meant to have, the truth was that a part of her couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. How she longed to be a part of that world again, to be there with him, to see him in his element, thriving and living fully. But she couldn't. Not anymore. Oso was a wild animal now, and while he might remember her, he no longer needed her the way he once did. She knew that. Still, the knowledge didn't make the ache in her heart any less. If anything, it made it worse. The finality of the situation weighed heavily on her, and there were nights when she found herself wishing for just one more day with him, one more chance to hear his heavy footsteps on the cabin floor, to feel the warmth of his presence beside her. The forest, which had once been their playground, had become a reminder of all that she had lost. Every path she walked seemed like a memory, each tree standing as a monument to their shared past. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the branches, Emma could almost hear Oso's growl, distant but familiar, as though he were still out there, just beyond the tree line. It would startle her, and for a moment, she would allow herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Oso was still near. But then reality would set back in, and she would remember that he had left. He had gone, and she had to accept that. She would sigh deeply, turn away from the woods, and make her way back to the cabin, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Winter settled in fully, blanketing the world in snow and ice. The village, once so full of life, seemed to slow down in the harsh cold. But for Emma, the passage of time felt almost irrelevant. Every day was the same, a blur of quiet moments spent alone in her cabin. She had grown used to the emptiness, but it never quite felt right. The hole that Oso had left in her life was still there, a constant reminder of what she had given up. And yet, as much as she missed him, there were moments when she began to wonder if perhaps the distance had been for the best. Maybe Oso had needed this space to grow, to become the wild creature he was always meant to be. Maybe it was the only way he would truly be happy. Still, no matter how many times she told herself that, it didn't erase the longing that gnawed at her heart every time she thought of him. Would he ever come back? Would he remember her, even if it meant crossing paths again after all this time? She didn't know, and as the winter months dragged on, that uncertainty became her constant companion. But one thing was certain, the days of her life would never be the same again. Oso had changed her, had left a mark on her soul that could never be erased. And though she could never truly know what the future held, she would always carry with her the love they shared, a love that, no matter how wild the world around them, could never be broken. The storm raged outside Emma's cabin, a furious display of nature's power that mirrored the turmoil she felt in her heart. The wind howled through the trees, the rain lashed at the windows, and thunder echoed in the distance like a warning from the heavens. The village was quiet, everyone huddled inside, away from the fury of the storm. But Emma couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling deep inside her, the ache in her chest that had been growing ever since Oso left. She hadn't seen him for months, and yet, every instinct in her told her that the bear she raised was out there, somewhere, needing her, or perhaps, more painfully, searching for her. It was an unsettling feeling, one that she couldn't shake. Emma sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the flashing lights outside, the storm amplifying her already heightened emotions. She told herself that it was simply the isolation talking, the grief of losing Oso finally catching up to her. But as she stared into the wild, darkened forest, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. Then, there was the knock on her door. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she wanted company. But when she opened the door, it was the village elder, a weathered man named Elias, who stood there, his face grim. His deep-set eyes seemed heavy with the weight of what he had to say, and his voice was low as he spoke. "You need to stay inside tonight, Emma," Elias said quietly. "There's been a sighting. A bear, much larger than the ones in these parts. The hunters are out looking for it, but I think they're wrong. This one, it's different." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had heard stories of Oso's size growing rapidly in the months since he left, but she had never imagined he would be the one that had caused such fear. "Where did they see it?" she asked, her voice betraying her growing anxiety. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. On the far side of the forest, Elias replied, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure no one overheard. "Too close to the village for comfort. It's been scavenging, making its way closer to the homes. We think it's desperate, maybe hungry." Desperate. Hungry. Emma could barely breathe. She knew this wasn't just another wild bear wandering into the village. She could feel it in her bones. Oso had returned. He was out there, right now, lost and searching. Elias, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. I need to go out there. I need to find him. The elder stared at her in disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what she was asking. Emma, no. You can't. The storm, the bear, it's too dangerous. The villagers are already on edge, and if they see you with that creature... It's not just any creature. Emma interrupted, her voice rising with emotion. It's Oso. He's not just some wild bear, he's my friend, my family. I raised him. He needs me. He trusts me. Elias took a step back, clearly taken aback by her words. You don't know that, Emma. He may remember you, but he is still a wild animal. You've heard the stories. We all have. The bond you shared might not be enough to keep you safe. Emma's gaze darkened, the fire in her heart burning even fiercer. I don't care about the danger. I know him. I know Oso, and if there's even a chance he's out there, I need to see him. You can't stop me. Elias' weathered face softened, a deep sigh escaping his lips. You're stubborn, just like your mother, he muttered, more to himself than to Emma. He paused for a moment, looking her up and down. You've got the same determination, I'll give you that. But I can't just let you walk out into that storm alone. You'll need help. If you're really set on this, I'll go with you. The decision was made. Despite all the warnings, despite all the logic that screamed at her to stay inside, Emma was resolute. She had to see Oso again. The storm had created an eerie silence around her, a void that made it feel as though the world itself was holding its breath. She knew this was her only chance to find him before it was too late. Before someone else tried to hunt him down. The storm was only getting worse as they set out, but Emma barely noticed the cold as they trudged through the forest, the trees groaning above them in protest. The rain pelted down relentlessly, and the wind whipped through the branches, making every sound seem amplified and terrifying. But Emma's focus was unyielding. She couldn't allow herself to feel the weight of the storm or the impending danger. She had to find Oso. The further they went, the more treacherous the terrain became. Branches snapped overhead, and the ground was slick with mud. Elias, though older and slower, kept up with her, muttering warnings under his breath about wild animals and the unpredictability of storms. But Emma barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the dark, twisting path ahead of them, her mind racing with images of Oso, his massive frame, his playful eyes, the way he used to nudge her hand for attention. She could almost feel him there, just beyond her reach. Suddenly, Elias stopped. His hand shot out to grab her arm, his voice urgent. Do you hear that? Emma froze, straining her ears against the wind and rain. It was faint, but there it was again, low, rumbling, a growl, almost a roar. Her heart leapt in her chest, and without a second thought, she pulled free from Elias' grasp and started running toward the sound. Emma, wait! Elias shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the storm and the thunderous growl that seemed to come from every direction. She ran faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the sounds grew louder. Then, suddenly, the storm seemed to part. The forest fell silent, the wind stilled, and all that was left was the pounding of her heart. She looked up, and there, standing in the clearing before her, was the silhouette of a massive bear. Emma's breath caught in her throat. There he was. Oso. It took her a moment to recognize him fully. His fur was matted with rain, his eyes dark and wild, but there was no mistaking it. The bear standing before her was Oso. He had grown so much since she last saw him. Towering over her, his muscles rippling with raw power. But in his eyes, she still saw the same spark, the same familiar recognition. Oso, Emma whispered, her voice breaking as she stepped forward, her heart soaring. It's me, it's Emma. The bear didn't move at first. He stood there, watching her with those deep, knowing eyes, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Then, without warning, he took a step toward her, his massive paws leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Emma's heart swelled with a mix of joy and fear. She knew Oso. She knew that deep down, he recognized her too. But the wildness in his eyes, the rawness of his power, reminded her of the danger she was in. He was no longer the playful cub she had raised. He was a force of nature, a creature bound by instincts she could never fully understand. "Please, Oso," she said softly, holding out her hand. "Please don't be afraid. It's me. I won't hurt you." For a long moment, Oso merely stood there, his eyes locked on hers. Then, with a low rumble, he took another step forward. It wasn't an attack, but rather a sign of recognition. Emma's hand trembled as she reached out to touch him, her fingers brushing against his fur. But then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. The sound of footsteps broke through the stillness, and Emma's head snapped around to see a group of villagers approaching, their torches flickering in the storm. Elias had been right, they were hunting Oso. The storm was relentless, with fierce winds howling through the trees and rain lashing against Emma's face as she ventured deeper into the forest. Each step felt heavier, the ground beneath her feet slick and treacherous. But she pushed forward, driven by an overwhelming need to see him again, to feel his presence near her, even if it meant defying all the warnings she had heard. She had spent countless days missing Oso, wondering if he was all right, if he had found his place in the wild. And yet, deep down, she had always known this moment would come. The bond they had shared, forged in the warmth of her cabin, in the quiet of the forest, had never truly broken. It had only been paused. She couldn't shake the belief that Oso was out there, somewhere. In her heart, she could feel his presence, as if the forest itself had called her back to him. Her lantern swung at her side, casting trembling shadows along the path as she walked. Her breath came in sharp bursts as the cold wind bit through her clothes, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the thought of what she might find. She had no idea how Oso had changed during the months they had been apart. Would he remember her? Would he still recognize the woman who had once fed him bottles of milk and scratched behind his ears? Or had he become so wild that their bond had faded away, lost to the forest? Despite her fears, Emma couldn't turn back. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way toward the clearing she had spotted in the distance. It was eerily quiet now, save for the deafening sound of the rain. The birds had stopped calling, and even the usual rustle of small animals seemed to have vanished. As she drew closer to the clearing, her senses heightened, every crack of a branch beneath her boots, every gust of wind felt amplified in the stillness. And then, there it was. Through the veil of rain, she saw him. Standing in the center of the clearing, Oso's enormous form was illuminated by flashes of lightning, his dark fur glistening in the brief moments of light. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. He was even more magnificent than she remembered, tall, muscular, a force of nature. But there was a tension in the air, an electric charge that ran through the space between them. Oso stood perfectly still, his head turned toward her, his eyes gleaming like twin orbs in the darkness. For a moment, Emma froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the weight of the years between them, the distance that had separated them physically and emotionally. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would he see her as a stranger? Would he fear her, as the villagers feared him? Would he attack? The question swirled in her mind, drowning out all rational thought. Oso, in that moment, didn't move. He only stared at her, unblinking, as though he was studying her, trying to make sense of the strange figure standing before him. Emma's heart raced, and despite the rain and the storm, she felt warmth spread through her chest. She knew this bear, more than anyone else in her life. There was no mistaking the intelligence in his eyes, the recognition that flickered behind them. She had spent so many hours caring for him, teaching him, protecting him. Could he possibly remember her after all this time? Tentatively, she took a step forward, her legs feeling as if they were made of stone. Her voice was a whisper, almost swallowed by the storm, but she couldn't stop herself. "Oso," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. It's me. It's Emma. The words felt hollow in the air, like a prayer that had no guarantee of being answered. She wasn't sure if he would respond, if he even understood. But then, slowly, Oso took a step toward her, his massive paws sinking into the wet ground with each careful step. Emma's heart leapt in her chest. Could it be? Was he actually moving toward her? She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the rain-soaked fabric of her jacket. Her breath caught as he continued to move closer, his movements deliberate but not aggressive. It wasn't until he was mere feet away from her that Emma could see the full depth of his expression. There was no aggression, no anger. In his eyes, there was something deeper, something far more intimate, more vulnerable. It was a look she had seen countless times when he was a cub, a look of curiosity mixed with recognition, like a child finally finding their mother after being lost in the woods. She lowered her hand cautiously, the motion slow and deliberate. There was a moment of hesitation in Oso's gaze, as though he, too, was unsure of what to do. His nostrils flared, sniffing the air around her, but instead of retreating or becoming hostile, he took another step forward, and his enormous head nuzzled against her hand. The gesture was gentle, as though he was testing her, as though he was seeing if she would respond the way she used to. Emma's heart surged, tears welling in her eyes. The wild had not stolen him from her. He remembered her. Oso, she whispered again, her voice full of wonder. I knew you'd remember me. For a few brief moments, they stood there together, the storm raging around them, but neither of them seemed to care. Emma's fingers stroked the soft, wet fur of his neck, feeling the same warmth and power that had once made him feel like family to her. Oso's deep, rumbling growl vibrated through her chest, but it wasn't threatening. It was a sound she remembered well, a sound of contentment, of trust. She closed her eyes, letting herself be flooded by the memories of their time together, the playful moments, the quiet companionship, and the unconditional love that had flowed between them. But then, a sharp crack of thunder jolted her out of her reverie, and she opened her eyes to find Oso staring at her once more, his posture shifting. It was as though the recognition was complete, and now he was once again the wild creature he had become. His eyes softened, but there was a subtle shift, a warning. He was no longer the cub she had raised. He was a grown bear, one who lived in a world far removed from her cabin. Emma took a step back, her heart heavy but full. She knew the time had come to let him go again. There was a sadness in her chest, a finality that gripped her heart, but she also knew that this moment was a gift. He hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't abandoned her. Oso had come back, not as the cub she had cared for, but as a wild creature who had returned to acknowledge the bond they had shared. And that was enough. As she turned to leave, a final piece of her heart breaking as she did, Oso gave her one last look. She wasn't sure what the expression in his eyes meant, but there was something there that made her believe, no matter where the wild took him, no matter how far apart they might be, he would always remember her. And in that moment, Emma understood. He was not hers to keep. He had always been meant for the wild, to live and thrive as a creature of the forest. But their bond was real, and it would never be erased, no matter how far apart they were. With one final glance, Emma turned and began to walk away, the rain still falling heavily around her. The storm might rage, the wilderness might call, but her heart was no longer heavy with uncertainty. She had seen him again. She had seen the love, the recognition, and the bond they shared. And for that, she was at peace. The rain came down in sheets, turning the ground into a slippery, muddy mess as Emma stepped into the clearing. The storm raged overhead, but in this one moment, the chaos of the world seemed to melt away. There, standing in the flickering light of a distant lightning strike, was Oso. His massive form was unmistakable, though his fur was darker, thicker, and his presence more imposing than she remembered. The cub she had once cradled in her arms was now a full-grown bear, towering and wild. For a moment, Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was as if the world stood still, the rain, the thunder, and even the howling wind seeming to pause for just a heartbeat. Her eyes locked with his, and in that fleeting moment, she saw something familiar, a spark of recognition. His face softened, and his gaze shifted from cautious to something she could only describe as curious. He wasn't just a wild animal standing before her, he was her Oso. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a tentative step forward. She didn't know if this was foolishness or desperation, but the bond they shared was undeniable, even after all these years. The wild had claimed him, but a part of him, deep down, still remembered the quiet moments, the soft murmurs, the walks through the woods they used to take together. His eyes, wide and alert, never left hers as she moved closer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade as Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, trembling with a mixture of fear and longing. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to heed the warnings that had echoed in her ears for so long. "He's wild now," they had said. "He's not the same bear you raised. The danger is real." But Emma couldn't tear herself away. She had raised Oso, she had loved him with everything she had. And now, here he was, alive, strong, and free. Was this the moment when their paths would diverge forever, or could she find a way to bridge the gap between the wild and the tame? As the minutes stretched on, Emma took another cautious step toward him. The rain pounded down harder, soaking her to the bone, but she didn't care. She had to know if the connection they had was still alive. And just as her outstretched hand was about to reach out, something incredible happened. Oso, who had been standing still, his body tense and his muscles coiled, slowly lowered his head. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Emma's heart skipped a beat. For a second, she thought he might back away, retreating back into the forest, leaving her with nothing but the memory of their past. But then, his ears perked up, and something in his eyes softened. He recognized her. It wasn't just an instinct or a fleeting moment of familiarity. It was something deeper, something that connected the two of them in a way that words could never explain. Emma could feel it in the way he watched her, in the way his body relaxed ever so slightly. She knew then that all of the warnings, all the fears, and all the doubts she had about their reunion, about him being dangerous, faded into the background. The air between them shifted, a subtle but powerful change. Oso, for all his wild strength, seemed to hesitate. It was as though he was uncertain, not of her presence, but of how to respond. He had lived in the wilderness for years, without human contact, without the comfort of a familiar voice or touch. He was a bear, untamed, free, and powerful, and yet, there was something else in him, a longing for connection, a yearning for the bond they had once shared. Slowly, Oso took a few tentative steps forward. His movements were careful, measured, as if he feared that any wrong move could break the fragile moment between them. Emma, too, was frozen, unsure of what to do. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to reassure herself that this wasn't a dream. But she knew the risks. She knew that a single misstep could be fatal. Still, her hand shook as she held it out, her voice trembling as she whispered his name. Oso. It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of years of memories, of shared experiences. The days when he had been just a cub, nuzzling her side as they explored the forest together. The nights when he had curled up beside her in the cabin, seeking warmth and comfort. She had never imagined that one day she would stand in the rain, face to face with the bear she had once raised, unsure of what would happen next. But Oso wasn't just any bear. He was hers. As she spoke his name, Oso stopped in his tracks. For a brief, fleeting second, Emma thought he might turn away, his wild instincts taking over. But instead, he let out a low growl, soft, almost gentle. The sound was unfamiliar, but somehow comforting, a reminder of the closeness they had shared in the past. And then, to her astonishment, he took another step forward, closing the gap between them. Emma's heart raced. She had always known that the bond between them was special, but she hadn't realized just how deep it went until this moment. Oso wasn't just a bear, he was a reflection of the love and trust they had built over the years. And in this moment, he was showing her that he remembered it all, the warmth of her touch, the sound of her voice, the way she had always cared for him. With one final, tentative step, Oso reached her. His large, damp nose brushed against her outstretched hand, and Emma gasped, a flood of emotions rushing through her. He was here. He was real. And in that moment, she could feel his trust, his recognition of her. It wasn't just the wild animal standing before her. It was the same creature she had raised, the same soul she had nurtured with love. And as their eyes met once more, Emma knew that this reunion wasn't just a chance encounter, it was the result of years of love, sacrifice, and understanding. But even as she stood there, stroking his damp fur, a part of her couldn't shake the fear that lingered in the back of her mind. The world had changed. Oso had changed. He was no longer the cub she had raised, he was a wild bear, a creature of the forest. And no matter how strong their connection was, that fact remained. As if sensing her unease, Oso pulled back slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a sadness in his gaze, a deep understanding that their time together was fleeting. He had returned to her, but the wilderness still called to him. The storm raged on above them, but Emma could no longer hear it. She was lost in this moment, lost in the reunion with the creature she had once saved, and who had, in turn, saved her heart. And as the rain poured down, she knew that this would be the last time they would meet. The bond between them would always exist, but the wild would always have a hold on Oso. And as he turned to leave, disappearing into the darkness of the forest once more, Emma stood there, her heart heavy with love and loss. She had raised him, loved him, and let him go, and in doing so, she had given him the freedom he had always deserved. But in her heart, Oso would always be hers. The wild couldn't take that away. The air was thick with tension, a storm of uncertainty that whipped through the forest like a living, breathing thing. Lightning cracked in the distance, and the steady rumble of thunder seemed to echo Emma's heartbeat, each thump shaking her to the core. She could feel Oso's massive presence behind her, the hairs on her neck standing on end as the sounds of movement grew closer. There was no mistaking it now, the villagers were here, and their intentions were clear. They were coming for Oso, convinced that he posed a threat to her, and perhaps to the village. In the months since Emma had released him back into the wild, the bear had become a part of the forest. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The local villagers spoke of a wild creature, often sighted near the edge of town but never too close, never causing harm. Still, they knew what a bear was capable of. They feared him, and when word spread that Emma had gone searching for him, they quickly organized a search party. Armed with rifles, they trekked into the storm to find Oso and, if necessary, put an end to the threat they believed he represented. Emma's heart was torn between two overwhelming emotions, love for the bear who had been her companion and the fear for his safety that her community held. The faint echo of footsteps crunching through the underbrush signaled that they were getting closer. The cold wind bit into her skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy fear that gripped her chest. Could she save him? Would he survive this? Or was this the final chapter in their shared story? A flicker of movement from behind her caught her eye, and she turned slowly. Oso was there, his great frame just beyond the reach of the trees, watching her with eyes that were both wild and familiar. His thick coat was matted with rain, but his posture was one of silent power. He was the bear of the wild now, the beast he had grown into. Yet in his gaze, Emma still saw that glimmer of recognition, the same deep connection that had existed between them when he was a cub. He wasn't a threat to her. He never had been. Emma took a shaky step forward, feeling the weight of the decision bearing down on her. Her heart was racing, but she was resolute. She couldn't let the villagers shoot him. She couldn't let them make the same mistake twice. She had raised him, loved him, and had been a part of his life for so long that she could never allow him to be viewed as an enemy, no matter how big or dangerous he seemed. "Please, Oso," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't let them hurt you." The bear stood frozen for a moment, then, as though sensing the urgency in her voice, he slowly began to step forward. The sound of his massive paws against the earth seemed deafening, but Emma felt the deep connection between them, a bond that no amount of time or distance had erased. He was still her bear. He was still her friend. Suddenly, the group of villagers emerged into the clearing. Their torches illuminated the space around them, casting long, exaggerated shadows that made the forest seem even more intimidating. As their eyes landed on Oso, panic rippled through the group. The men stiffened, some clutching their rifles tightly, others standing frozen as the reality of the situation dawned on them. The bear wasn't a myth. He wasn't a distant threat. He was real. He was right there, and he was massive, far more imposing than they had anticipated. "Get back," one of the hunters yelled, his voice trembling with fear. "That's a wild animal. It's dangerous." But Emma was already stepping forward, her hands raised in a calming gesture, her heart pounding with desperation. She was between the villagers and Oso now, a fragile human shield standing between a creature of the wild and the people who feared him. "Oso, please," she said again, her voice quieter this time, but no less urgent. "Don't do anything. Just stand still. They won't hurt you if you don't make them." The villagers were shouting now, confused, fearful, some pleading for her to get away. But Emma stood firm, staring at them as she did the bear, her body taut with tension, her eyes full of the raw emotion of a woman who had given everything for this creature, for this bond. "Oso, they're afraid," she said, her voice softening. "But you know me. You know I'll never hurt you." For a moment, nothing happened. The tension in the air hung like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, with a soft grunt, Oso stepped forward, his great body moving like a shadow in the rain. He stood just inches behind Emma now, his huge head towering over her, his breath steady and warm against her skin. The villagers gasped, eyes wide, some of them stepping back, others frozen in place. Oso was now a wall between Emma and the hunters, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The wind died down, the rain slowed, and the forest seemed to breathe with them. Emma felt the raw power of the bear behind her, the same creature she had raised with love, who had once been so small in her hands, so vulnerable. But now, he was here to protect her, just as he had always protected her. She was no longer just a caretaker to him, she was someone worth protecting in his eyes, too. But then, something shifted. One of the hunters, his rifle still aimed at Oso, took a hesitant step forward. The tension in the air spiked as he raised his weapon, his finger brushing the trigger. "Stay back," he yelled. "This is our only chance. We have to take him down before he attacks." In that split second, Emma knew she had to act. There was no more time for words, no more room for hesitation. She turned to face Oso, her heart breaking in her chest. "Oso, please, no matter what happens, you have to leave." The bear let out a low growl, but there was no aggression in it. Instead, it was as if he were responding to her plea, recognizing the pain in her voice, understanding her decision. He glanced at the villagers, then back to her. And, with one final, lingering look, he turned and disappeared into the dense forest, melting into the shadows of the trees. Emma stood there for a moment, utterly still. The world seemed to hold its breath. There was no sound now, no movement. Just the quiet, the weight of everything that had just passed. She felt the warmth of Oso's body vanish, and for the first time, she was truly alone. The hunters stood motionless as well, their rifles still pointed, but the immediate danger was gone. There was no need to shoot, Oso had gone. Emma turned back to them, her face pale and her eyes full of unspeakable sorrow. She didn't have to say anything, the look in her eyes was enough. The men lowered their weapons, realizing that they were witnesses to something far greater than a simple act of survival. The bear had made a choice. He had made the sacrifice, and in doing so, he had proven that even in the wild, loyalty, love, and protection could transcend everything. As Emma took a few shaky steps back, her body trembling, the storm began to ease. The wind died down, the rain softened, and she was left in the quiet of the forest, carrying with her the memory of a bond that nothing, neither time nor fear nor the harsh realities of nature, could break. Oso had gone, but she would carry him forever, the bear who had been both wild and loving, fierce and tender, loyal beyond words. And she would always remember the love he had shown her, a love that no warning, no fear, could ever diminish. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.